At 4 minutes past 4, the birthday cake had not been touched, and Lady Mabel Harcaster had not moved her hands from her lap. The child sat beside 8 narrow candles in a blue and white china holder, her back straight beneath a cream muslin frock, her dark hair tied with a sober ribbon that made her look older than 8. Across the schoolroom, the mantel clock ticked with unbearable confidence. Judith Selcombe stood near the tea table and watched the minute hand climb. The Duke of Haverstock had promised to come at 4. He had not said he might come. He had not sent word that estate business detained him. He had simply promised. Would Papa like his tea stronger? Mabel asked. Her voice held the careful politeness of a child, determined not to sound disappointed. Judith looked at the second cup, waiting beside the silver pot. Your father generally takes it stronger than you do. Then we should leave it. Mabel glanced at the clock. He doesn't like tea once it's gone cold. Judith did not say that tea could be warmed. She did not say that promises could not. Outside the tall windows, October light lay pale across the lawns of Rookhaven Court. The house had taken on the restrained brightness expected for a ducal child's birthday. Fresh flowers stood on the schoolroom table. A new book waited beneath folded tissue. The iced sponge had been made small enough for a family tea, because Mabel had asked for no grand celebration. She had asked only that her father come upstairs before the county callers arrived. At 4 minutes past 4, the candles remained unlit. At 5 minutes past, footsteps passed in the corridor and continued toward the west staircase. Mabel's shoulders tightened, then settled. Mrs. Trench said, "The ladies will arrive at 4:30, she said. Lady Gertrude thought they might like to see the cake. This cake is yours. Lady Gertrude says everything in a great house belongs, partly to the people who must approve of it." Judith allowed herself one quiet breath before answering. A birthday does not require approval. Mabel looked at her. For an instant, the child's mouth trembled. Then she turned back to the clock. At 6 minutes past 4, she noticed the cup meant, for her father had not been brought from the adjoining day nursery. "I left the Worcester cup beside the cabinet," Judith said. "I shall fetch it." The day nursery stood through the inner door, scarcely 12 steps away. Judith crossed the small room, took the cup from the side table, and returned before the fire had time to shift in the grate. The schoolroom had changed, not visibly at first. Mabel sat where she had been. The cake remained untouched. The curtains did not stir, yet something had vanished from the room. Judith stopped. The ticking had ceased. The mantel clock showed 7 minutes past 4. Its long brass pendulum hung motionless behind the glass. Mabel stared at it. "Perhaps it grew tired," she whispered. Judith set down the cup. "Clocks do not usually tire. People do." "Yes." Judith approached the mantel without touching it. The clock had been wound that morning. She knew because she had heard its steady movement through lessons and luncheon. Her maternal grandfather had repaired watches in Bath, and she had spent half her childhood sorting tiny screws into shallow dishes. This clock had not run down. "Did you touch it, Lady Mabel?" The child's face went still. No, Judith believed her. Mabel looked down at the unlit candles. "Clocks are cruel when they prove people late." The sentence was too quiet to be theatrical. It was the sort of truth a child spoke only when she had tried very hard not to speak at all. Judith knelt beside her. "Your father is late, whether the clock moves or not." Mabel's eyes filled, but no tear fell. A duchess's daughter shouldn't cry because a gentleman is busy. A child may be hurt when someone breaks a promise. Even if he's a duke, especially if he is her father. Footsteps sounded at last. They came quickly this time, not with the measured pace of a servant. The schoolroom door opened, and Maurice Harcaster, Duke of Haverstock, entered with cold air on his coat and impatience still sharpened across his face. He was a tall man whose restraint made other people lower their voices without knowing why. Today, however, his composure broke the instant he saw the table. His gaze moved from the untouched cake to his daughter, then to Judith. "Mabel." The child rose. "Good afternoon, Papa." Maurice drew out his pocket watch. The gold case flashed in the dimming light. "It is 4:28. His eyes lifted to the mantel. The schoolroom clock remained at 4:07. "Why has that stopped?" Judith did not answer before Mabel. "I don't know, Your Grace." Maurice crossed the room and crouched before the clock, examining the face without opening the case. "Was it running when you came in?" "It was running until I stepped into the day nursery at 4:06. When I returned, it had stopped." "You left Mabel alone for less than a minute." The inner door remained open. His expression tightened, but not toward her. "Who entered?" "No one that I saw." Mabel stood beside the chair, her hands now gripping the folds of her dress. Maurice looked at her. "Did anyone come into the room?" She did not answer. His features softened by a degree so slight that another person might have missed it. Judith did not. "You are not in trouble," he said. "You won't be punished for telling me the truth." Mabel swallowed. "I don't want anyone to be angry. That is not the same as saying no one came." Before she could reply, Lady Gertrude Peverell appeared at the doorway in plum-colored silk, carrying the authority of a relative who had long mistaken familiarity for command. "There you are, Maurice. The first carriages are expected within minutes." Her gaze fell upon Mabel, then the untouched cake. "This will not do. The child should be taken downstairs before anyone sees her in such a state." Maurice rose. "What state is that?" Gertrude's smile thinned, overwrought. Miss Selcombe appears to have allowed the occasion to become rather emotional. Judith kept her hands still. Gertrude looked toward the dead clock, and now even the room seems arranged for effect. Maurice turned his head. "Arranged by whom, I am sure I could not say." "Then do not imply it." The words were quiet. They carried farther than anger would have. Gertrude drew herself up. "I am thinking of Mabel's dignity. So am I." Maurice moved to his daughter and lowered himself until they were eye to eye. "I was told a tenant deputation waited at the north gate. No one was there. I should have verified the message. I did not. I am sorry." Mabel stared at him as if the apology were more startling than his absence. "You came. Late. You're a duke. That is not an excuse." The child's fingers loosened in her skirt. Maurice looked at the cake. "May I sit with you?" Mabel hesitated, then nodded. "You may sit. May I cut the cake?" Her gaze moved to the candles. "Not yet." He accepted the refusal without protest and took the chair beside her. Only then did he look again at Judith. "No one touches the clock." Gertrude gave a small laugh. "Maurice, surely you do not intend to make a household inquiry out of a stopped mechanism." "I intend to learn why my daughter was left waiting beside an untouched cake while I was sent to an empty gate." He glanced toward the corridor where the butler had appeared. "Send for the village clockmaker. Ask Mrs. Trench to remain with Lady Mabel. The county callers may wait downstairs." Gertrude's face cooled. "You would keep half the county waiting over this." Maurice looked at his daughter. "They will survive it." The clockmaker arrived before 5, smelling faintly of oil and rain. He examined the clock with careful hands, while Maurice, Judith, and the housekeeper watched. Mabel had been taken to the window seat with her tea. though she had still not permitted the candles to be lit. After several silent minutes, the old man opened the rear case and leaned closer. "The spring is sound, Your Grace." Maurice's gaze sharpened. "Then why did it stop?" The clockmaker reached inside with a pair of narrow brass tweezers. When he withdrew them, something pale and thin rested between their tips. "It didn't stop by itself," he said. "Someone put this into the mechanism." The pale sliver lay between the clockmaker's tweezers, no longer than the nail of Maurice's smallest finger and thin enough to vanish against the old man's palm. For several seconds, no one spoke. Even Lady Gertrude had fallen still at the threshold. The schoolroom seemed unnaturally quiet without the clock, as though the silence itself had become evidence. "What is it?" Maurice asked. The clockmaker lowered the object onto a square of clean paper. "Ivory, Your Grace." "Shaved very fine." He bent over the open case again. It was pressed behind the pendulum arm, not dropped there. Whoever placed it knew where to put it. Judith looked toward Mabel. The child sat near the window with both hands around her teacup. She was watching the adults carefully, not with curiosity, but with the strained attention of someone trying to discover which answer would keep the room peaceful. Maurice noticed it too. "Mrs. Trench," he said. "Please take Lady Mabel to the day nursery." Mabel's fingers tightened around the cup. "Am I being sent away because I did something wrong?" Maurice crossed to her at once. "No." "Then why can't I stay?" "Because I have questions for the adults." His voice softened. "You don't have to solve this for us." Mabel searched his face. "You won't be angry if I remember something later?" "I won't. Even if it is about someone important?" Maurice did not look toward Gertrude, especially then. Mabel gave the smallest nod and allowed the housekeeper to lead her through the inner door. Gertrude waited until it closed. "This has already gone much too far. A bit of ivory in an old clock does not prove malice." "It proves interference," Maurice said. "That is enough to continue." "And what exactly do you imagine happened? Someone crept into the schoolroom to stop 7 minutes past 4 for dramatic effect." "I do not imagine. I establish." His gaze settled on the clockmaker. "Can the object be preserved?" "Certainly, Your Grace." The old man folded the paper without touching the ivory again, then wrote his initials across the overlapping edge. Mrs. Trench returned in time to receive the packet. Maurice instructed her to place it in the locked drawer of his study and retain the key herself until morning. "No one opens it without you, Mr. Bell and me present," he said. The clockmaker bowed. "As you wish, Your Grace." Judith remained beside the mantel. She had not touched the case, and she was careful not to lean near it now. "The clock had kept proper time all day," she said. "I heard it during the geography lesson. It struck 3 while Lady Mabel was writing to her godmother." Gertrude's attention sharpened. "You are remarkably certain of its habits." "My grandfather repaired watches." "How convenient." Judith turned to her. "Knowledge is often convenient when the truth depends upon it." Maurice's eyes moved briefly to Judith's face. There was no gratitude in his expression yet, but there was recognition. He had heard the insult. He had also heard her refuse to bend beneath it. "The clock stays here tonight," he said. "The room will be locked after Lady Mabel retires. Mr. Bell will return tomorrow to examine the mechanism in daylight." "Maurice," Gertrude said, "the county callers are still below. Then you may tell them my daughter's birthday tea has become private. They will talk. They already do." He turned away from her. "Miss Selcombe, did anyone know you would leave the room for the cup?" Judith considered the question. Lady Mabel mentioned it aloud. The inner door was open. Anyone in the corridor might have heard. How long were you absent? Less than a minute. Long enough, he asked the clockmaker. For a practiced hand, yes. For a nervous one, perhaps, the rear panel opens easily. Maurice looked toward the corridor. Who passed this door? Mrs. Trench answered from memory. A footman had carried coal to the west passage. A maid had gone toward the linen stairs. Lady Gertrude had been seen near the upper landing, though no one could say at precisely what minute. Cuthbert Peverell had left the drawing-room shortly before 4, claiming he wished to find Maurice. None of it was proof. All of it mattered. Gertrude's mouth thinned. You cannot question every person in this house, because a governess lost sight of a clock. Maurice's expression hardened. Miss Selcombe did not lose sight of it. Someone used the moment she turned away. Gertrude looked at Judith then, and the elegance of her face could not disguise the resentment beneath it. Maurice rang for the butler. Have the north gatekeeper brought to my study. Send someone to ask whether the tenant deputation was ever expected today. At this hour, Your Grace, at this hour. He glanced toward the day nursery. Before my daughter decides, silence is safer than truth. The first questioning began after the county carriages had rolled away from Rookhaven. The north gatekeeper arrived with rain darkening the shoulders of his coat and alarm in every line of his posture. He stood before Maurice's desk, while Judith remained near the door at the Duke's request. Mrs. Trench kept the sealed ivory packet in her pocket. Cuthbert Peverell had joined them without invitation, his manner wounded rather than uneasy. You asked for the time of the deputation, Your Grace, the gatekeeper said. 5 o'clock. That was the hour given. Maurice sat very still. By whom? Mr. Peverell spoke to me yesterday. He said the tenants from the North Farms were to be admitted at 5. Maurice turned to Cuthbert. You told me they were waiting before 4. Cuthbert gave a short, incredulous laugh. Then I confused the hour. You were precise enough to send me across the estate. It was an ordinary mistake. Where are the tenants now? They came at 5, the gatekeeper said. They were told His Grace was engaged and returned home. Maurice's jaw tightened. Who told them that? Mr. Peverell, Your Grace. Cuthbert lifted one shoulder. You were occupied with family matters by then. I thought it better not to disturb you. The silence that followed was colder than anger. Judith saw the sequence settle into place in Maurice's mind. He had been sent to an empty gate before 4. The real deputation had arrived at 5. Someone had stopped the schoolroom clock between those hours. Cuthbert had controlled both messages, yet Maurice did not accuse him, not yet. From this moment, the Duke said, no guest alters an appointment involving Lady Mabel. No instruction concerning the schoolroom is to be obeyed unless it comes directly from me, Mrs. Trench or Miss Selcombe. Cuthbert's brows rose. You are placing a governess above family. I am placing responsibility above presumption. Maurice looked toward the butler. Make the order known tonight. When the others had gone, Judith remained because Maurice had not dismissed her. He stood at the window, staring into the darkened grounds. My daughter asked whether she would be punished for remembering, he said. Children ask such questions when they have learned that truth inconveniences adults. Do you believe she saw someone? I believe she is afraid that she did. Maurice turned. What does she need from me? The question held no command. Judith answered with equal care. She needs you not to make your affection depend upon what she can prove. Something in his face altered, not softened, deepened. And from you? Permission to tell her the truth without teaching her whom to blame. He nodded once. You have it. In the day nursery, Mabel sat beneath a lamp, with the untouched candles lined before her. Maurice entered alone. Judith waited at the open inner door, near enough for propriety and far enough to give them privacy. "May I ask one question?" he said. Mabel nodded. "Did anyone speak about the clock before it stopped?" She stared at the 8th candle. Someone said the ticking should stop. Maurice did not move closer. "Who?" Her lips parted, then closed. "I don't want anyone to be sent away. No one will be punished because you're frightened. That isn't the same as no one being punished." Maurice absorbed the distinction. "No," he said, "it isn't." He did not press her again. Instead, he sat across from her while Mrs. Trench brought a fresh pot of tea. Mabel finally allowed him to cut the cake. She ate one small slice and watched him eat another. But the 8th candle remained unlit on its china saucer. The following morning, as Judith crossed the upper gallery on her way to lessons, Lady Gertrude stood beside the window, sorting calling cards from an ivory case. One corner of the case had been newly wrapped in cream silk. Judith slowed only long enough to notice. Then she continued toward the schoolroom, carrying the knowledge in silence. Judith did not stop when she saw the cream silk wrapped around the damaged corner of Lady Gertrude's ivory card case. To hesitate would have been to reveal that she had noticed. She continued along the upper gallery, with Mabel's arithmetic books beneath one arm, past the gilt-framed portrait of the late Duchess, and entered the schoolroom at the usual hour. The mantel stood empty. The clock had been moved to the Duke's study, after the clockmaker completed his first examination, while the ivory sliver remained sealed in the paper packet under Mrs. Trench's custody. Without the clock, the room felt oddly exposed. Mabel had placed the unlit 8th candle in its china saucer beside the inkstand, where she could see it without touching it. "Lady Gertrude's card case is broken," she said before Judith had opened the first book. Judith looked at her. "Have you seen it before today?" "Yesterday morning. She dropped it near the east stairs." "Did the corner break then?" Mabel lowered her eyes to the numbers on her slate. "I don't know." The answer was too quick, but Judith did not press. Maurice had been right about one thing. A frightened child should not be made to carry an adult investigation. "Then we shall say only what we know," Judith said. "That is enough." Mabel traced the edge of the slate with one finger. "Papa said that too." There was surprise in her voice, as if Maurice had entered territory she had not expected him to understand. Before the lesson could begin, a footman arrived with a message. His Grace requested Miss Selcombe in the study. Mrs. Trench would remain with Lady Mabel. Judith set down the arithmetic book and followed him through the east corridor. The Duke's study smelled of leather, coal smoke, and the faint oil the clockmaker had used on his tools. Maurice stood beside the long desk. The clock rested on a folded cloth near the window, its rear panel open. Mr. Bell had returned as promised. Mrs. Trench stood opposite them, with the sealed packet still unbroken in her hand. Maurice glanced toward Judith as she entered. "Mr. Bell says you may be able to explain something he found." The clockmaker adjusted his spectacles. "Not what I found, miss. How it was placed." Judith approached only when Maurice gestured permission. The rear opening was narrow, but the path to the pendulum arm could be reached from behind without disturbing the clock face. She bent slightly, careful to keep her hands clasped before her. "The wedge did not fall through the vent," she said. "It was inserted here and pressed inward." Mr. Bell nodded. "Exactly." Maurice watched her reflection in the dark glass of the window. "You are certain?" My grandfather repaired watches and small clocks in Bath. He allowed me to clean cases and sort parts before I was old enough to understand their names. Most men would not have taught a girl. My grandfather preferred useful hands to obedient opinions. Something close to amusement touched Maurice's mouth, then vanished. Could someone unfamiliar with clocks have done this? Judith studied the opening again. Yes, if the person had watched the pendulum before. They would not need to understand the mechanism. They would need only to know where movement could be stopped. Mr. Bell added, and to have a sliver thin enough not to splinter inside. Mrs. Trench held up the sealed packet, such as the piece we recovered. Maurice's gaze sharpened. Could it have come from a card case? Judith felt the room contract. He had noticed the same object, or someone had mentioned it to him. She answered without looking toward the door. Ivory used for visiting card cases can be shaved thin. So can fan sticks, combs, counters, and small boxes. The material alone proves nothing. But the shape might, if there is a matching break. Maurice studied her for a moment. You saw something. It was not quite a question. Judith could have denied it and preserved herself from Lady Gertrude's displeasure. She could also have accused too quickly and damaged Mabel's trust. Lady Gertrude's card case has one corner wrapped in cream silk, she said. I saw it this morning. I do not know when the damage occurred. Mr. Bell looked interested. Maurice did not. His restraint became colder, which Judith had begun to understand was how he contained anger rather than how he expressed indifference. No one confronts her, he said. Not yet. I had no intention of doing so. His eyes met hers. Because she is my relation. Because suspicion is not proof. The answer held between them. Maurice lowered his gaze first, not in dismissal, but as if he had received a judgment he had not expected from a governess. Mrs. Trench, retain the packet. Mr. Bell, leave the clock stopped and close the case. It will remain here. The clockmaker obeyed. When he and the housekeeper withdrew, Maurice remained by the desk. Judith expected dismissal, but he said, Lady Gertrude believes you have used your previous acquaintance with my wife to secure influence over Mabel. Judith's pulse changed, though she kept her face still. Lady Gertrude is mistaken. You knew Anne before her marriage. For 1 year. I was companion to her widowed aunt in Bath. Anne visited often. Maurice looked toward the portrait miniature on his desk. Why did you not mention it when you applied for the position? Because I wanted to be judged on whether I could teach your daughter, and not on whether you could remind me of my wife. The bluntness might have wounded if it had not exposed his own fear so plainly. Judith answered with equal honesty. I had no wish to become a memorial in serviceable shoes. His eyes lifted. For a moment, grief showed without disguise. Anne spoke of you once or twice. She remembered that I disagreed with her. Most people did not. Most people wanted something. Maurice turned the miniature so the light no longer struck the glass. Gertrude says Mabel needs a woman of family. Mabel needs adults who do not make her prove love by denying pain. His expression tightened. You believe Gertrude does that? I believe Lady Gertrude speaks of dignity when she means silence. The words were dangerous. Judith knew it the moment they left her. Yet Maurice did not rebuke her. And Anne? He asked. What did she mean by dignity? Judith looked toward the closed study door. She believed dignity allowed a person to tell the truth without making a spectacle of it. She would not have wanted her memory used to bind Mabel to unhappiness. Silence settled between them, but it was not empty. Maurice touched one finger to the edge of the miniature. The dead are often made more convenient than they were in life, because they cannot object. And the living? They can, if someone permits them. His gaze returned to her. The air between them altered with such subtlety that Judith almost doubted it. He was still the Duke. She was still the governess. Yet he had asked for her judgment and listened as though rank had not already answered for him. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Trench re-entered, carrying a narrow household memorandum book. "Your Grace, I believe I have found something that should be seen." Maurice opened the book. The housekeeper pointed to 3 entries made over the previous 6 weeks. A garden walk between father and daughter had been entered at 3. Though Mabel had waited at 4, a music lesson demonstration had been set for noon in the schoolroom, while Maurice had been told one. The birthday tea appeared twice in different hands. 4 o'clock beside Judith's initials, 4:30 beside a note indicating county callers. "Who altered these?" Maurice asked. The changes came verbally. Mrs. Trench said, "Lady Gertrude delivered one. Mr. Peverell delivered another. The servants assumed they spoke with your authority." Judith looked at the repeated times. The birthday had not been an isolated cruelty. It had been the latest in a pattern. Maurice went very still. "How many occasions did Mabel wait for me?" Mrs. Trench hesitated. 3 that I can confirm." His face changed then, not dramatically. The knowledge simply entered him and found no place to hide. Judith saw him remember every time he had believed his daughter indifferent, every report that she had tired, forgotten, or preferred her lessons. He closed the book. From now on, no alteration concerning Lady Mabel's schedule is valid unless it comes directly from me, from you, or from Miss Selcombe. Put it in writing when possible. Repeat it back when it is not. "Yes, Your Grace." After Mrs. Trench left, Maurice remained standing with one hand on the memorandum book. "I thought she had stopped asking for me." Judith's voice softened despite herself. Children often stop asking before they stop hoping. He looked toward the clock, motionless on the cloth. "Tomorrow at 4, I will take tea with her." "Then do not promise 4 unless you mean to be in the room before the hour." His gaze met hers. "You are not afraid to correct me." "I am afraid. I simply do not consider fear a sufficient reason to fail her." This time the faintest smile reached his eyes. 4 o'clock, Miss Selcombe. Before the hour. He kept the promise. The following afternoon, Maurice entered the schoolroom, while the empty mantel showed 3 minutes to 4. Mabel looked at the space where the clock had stood, then at her father. She did not smile at once. She watched him remove his gloves, take the chair beside the tea table, and remain there when the hour passed. Only then did she begin telling him about the river systems she had drawn that morning. Judith poured the tea and said nothing. Trust had not returned, but for the first time it had somewhere to begin. Later, after Maurice had gone, Mrs. Trench paused at the schoolroom door. "Miss Selcombe," she said quietly. "The birthday was not the first occasion. I fear it may not be the last unless we understand why someone has been teaching this house to lose the same hour again and again. By the 5th morning after Mabel's birthday, Maurice had gathered enough small contradictions to make coincidence feel insulting. The household memorandum book lay open across his desk, its pages marked by 3 occasions in 6 weeks when father and daughter had been given different hours. Judith stood opposite him with Mrs. Trench beside her. Cuthbert Peverell occupied the chair nearest the fire, as though proximity to warmth confirmed his right to the room. Lady Gertrude had declined to attend, saying household confusions were beneath formal discussion. Maurice had not repeated the invitation. "The garden walk," he said, placing one finger beside the first entry. "I was told 3 o'clock. Judith looked at the page. Lady Mabel was prepared for 4. "Who delivered the change?" Mrs. Trench answered. "Lady Gertrude told the upper maid that your grace wished the child kept to lessons until 4. The maid repeated it to Miss Selcombe. Cuthbert crossed one ankle over the other. Gertrude likely misunderstood. Maurice ignored him and moved to the next line. "The music lesson demonstration." "Lady Mabel was ready at noon," Judith said. "You arrived at 1. "I was told 1. Mrs. Trench consulted a smaller note tucked into the memorandum book. "Mr. Peverell informed the second footman that noon had become inconvenient." Cuthbert gave a weary sigh. "You make it sound as though I altered the heavens. It was 1 hour. To you," Judith said, "to a child waiting to be seen, it was the whole occasion." His eyes sharpened. A governess should take care not to dramatize domestic inconveniences. A gentleman should take care not to dismiss consequences merely because he did not suffer them. Maurice looked up. Judith had not raised her voice. She had not appealed to him for support. Her calmness made Cuthbert's contempt appear smaller than anger would have done. "Miss Selcombe is here because she kept the correct hour," Maurice said. "You are here because twice you did not." Cuthbert's mouth hardened. "If your grace intends to place a paid dependent above family judgment, you may find the county draws its own conclusions. The county is not raising my daughter, no, but it will decide whether her household appears properly governed." Maurice turned the page toward him. "Proper governance would include knowing who may speak in my name." The third entry showed Mabel's birthday tea. Judith's hand had recorded 4 o'clock. Beside it, another note stated that county callers were expected at 4:30 and that the child should be brought downstairs beforehand. The handwriting belonged to the housekeeper's assistant, but the instruction had come verbally from Lady Gertrude. Maurice read it twice. She intended Mabel to be seen before the cake was cut. Lady Gertrude said the ladies would be charmed, Mrs. Trench replied. "Was I expected in the schoolroom when they arrived?" "The servants assumed so, Your Grace." Cuthbert leaned forward. "You are building an accusation from ordinary family arrangements. Gertrude wished the child presented suitably. I conveyed an estate appointment badly. That is all. You told me. Tenants waited at the north gate before 4 when their appointed hour was 5. I confused the time. You then dismissed them at 5 without consulting me. You were upstairs." Maurice's gaze became still. "Yes, I had finally reached my daughter." Cuthbert stood. "This is precisely the danger. A governess encourages a child's disappointment, and suddenly every missed hour becomes evidence of betrayal. Society will say, 'Miss Selcombe has taught you to see conspiracy wherever your duties conflict with nursery sentiment.'" Judith felt the insult land, but Maurice answered before she could. "Society may say what it likes. You will not use it to excuse speaking in my name." He rose and rang the bell. When the butler entered, Maurice gave the order plainly. No guest, relation or visitor was to alter any appointment involving Lady Mabel. Messages from the Duke were to pass through his valet or Mrs. Trench. If either was unavailable, the servant receiving the message must repeat it back and record the hour. Miss Selcombe retained authority over the schoolroom schedule. Any conflicting instruction would be brought directly to him. "Make it known before luncheon," he said, "to every member of the household." The butler bowed. Cuthbert gave a short laugh without humor. "You would reorganize an entire house because a child waited for tea." Maurice closed the memorandum book. I am reorganizing it because adults discovered they could make her wait without consequence. Cuthbert left without asking permission. Mrs. Trench followed to carry out the order, leaving Judith alone with Maurice. The clock remained on the cloth near the window, still stopped at 4:07. The sealed ivory packet was locked in the desk drawer, to which Mrs. Trench held the key. Judith glanced at the empty place where the memorandum book had lain. You have made the chain clearer, she said. That will not prevent every mistake. No, it will prevent people from hiding deliberate choices inside mistakes. He moved to the window. Below, a groom led a chestnut horse across the gravel. Did Mabel ever ask why I failed to come? Judith considered how much truth belonged to him, at first. And later she asked whether she had misunderstood. His hand tightened behind his back. She blamed herself. Children prefer self-blame to uncertainty. If the fault is theirs, they can imagine correcting it. Maurice was silent for several breaths. I thought she had become less interested in my visits. She became less willing to show interest. He turned. There is a difference, a painful one. He looked toward the stopped clock. I have managed estates through failed harvests, disputed leases, and a succession of men who believed my patience meant weakness. Yet I allowed 3 missed appointments with my daughter to pass, without asking who had changed the hour. You believed the household would function because it had always functioned. That is not a defense. No, her refusal to comfort him falsely seemed to steady him. He said, I shall take tea with Mabel at 4. Judith met his gaze, then arrive before 4. The corner of his mouth shifted. You have already given me that instruction. You require repetition when the matter is important. Do I? Most people do. He looked almost amused, but grief remained beneath it. 3 minutes before the hour. That would be wise. The next afternoon, Mabel sat at the schoolroom table with a geography copybook open before her. The mantel remained bare because the clock was still secured in Maurice's study. Even so, the child glanced toward the empty space twice before Judith asked her to finish labeling the Thames. At 5 minutes to 4, wheels sounded on the gravel below. Mabel's pencil stopped. That might be a caller. It might. At 4 minutes to 4, footsteps approached along the corridor. Mabel did not look up. She pressed the pencil harder against the page. Maurice entered at 3 minutes before the hour, exactly as promised. He wore no outdoor coat and carried no estate papers. Good afternoon, he said. Good afternoon, Papa. Mabel's voice was composed, but her eyes moved once toward the bare mantel. Maurice noticed. The clock is still in my study, he said. My watch says 3:57. I thought it best to be early. She studied him as if punctuality might be another adult performance arranged for her benefit. Will you have to leave when it is 4? No. At 5? Not unless you wish me gone. I don't. The answer escaped before she could soften it. Maurice took the chair beside her. Judith poured tea, then moved to the writing desk rather than remain between them. Mabel began with the Thames. Then she told him about the Severn, the Trent, and why rivers widened near the sea. Maurice listened without correcting what did not need correction. 4 o'clock passed. Then 10 minutes. Mabel looked toward the empty mantel again, but this time her shoulders loosened. Miss Selcombe says a river remembers every place that changed its course, she said. Maurice glanced at Judith. Does it? Not in the way people remember, Judith replied, but the land keeps the evidence. His gaze held hers for a moment. Then perhaps houses do as well. After tea, He remained long enough to examine Mabel's map and promise nothing beyond the next afternoon. When he finally left, Mabel watched the doorway. He came before the hour. He did. Perhaps he will tomorrow. Judith closed the geography book. Perhaps let him prove it one day at a time. Before dinner, Lady Gertrude sent word that she intended to host a county children's autumn luncheon at Rookhaven. The message said, the gathering would demonstrate that Lady Mabel had entirely recovered from the unfortunate birthday. Misunderstanding. Judith read the note twice. Somewhere below stairs, the new household order was already being repeated from servant to servant. Yet Gertrude had not tried to alter an hour. She had chosen something more dangerous. She intended to decide, before witnesses, what Mabel was permitted to feel for 4 afternoons in succession. Maurice entered the schoolroom before the hour, and on the 4th day, Mabel finally stopped watching the empty mantel long enough to finish a sentence. The clock itself remained in the Duke's study, silent and secured, while the ivory sliver stayed sealed beneath Mrs. Trench's custody. Yet its absence had not removed time from the room. Time lived in Mabel's glances, in the way she listened for footsteps before answering a question, and in the unlit 8th candle resting in its china saucer beside the inkstand. She had placed it there after the birthday tea and refused every suggestion that it be discarded. Judith had not asked why. She understood that children sometimes needed to preserve the exact shape of an unfinished feeling before they could let it change. Maurice noticed the candle during the 5th afternoon tea. He had arrived at 3:56, carrying no papers and wearing the expression of a man who had abandoned 3 urgent matters downstairs without regretting any of them. Mabel was reading aloud from a history of England when he interrupted gently. May I ask about the candle? Her eyes moved to the saucer. It's the 8th one. I know. The others were lit after you came, but not that one. Mabel closed the book with careful hands. It belonged to before. Maurice waited. Judith stood by the tea table and resisted the instinct to rescue either of them from the silence. Before what? He asked at last. Before I knew whether you would come. His face altered almost imperceptibly. And now I know you came late. Yes. If I light it, then it becomes part of after. Maurice looked at the small length of beeswax as though it contained an accusation no adult could dismiss. Would you like me to remove it? Mabel shook her head. No, I only don't want anyone to make me light it. No one will. Gertrude's voice sounded from the doorway. Surely we need not turn a candle into a monument. She entered in a dress of muted green, her damaged ivory card case nowhere visible. Children attach importance to objects when adults encourage them. Judith saw Mabel's shoulders stiffen. Maurice saw it too. Mabel may keep the candle, he said, for as long as she wishes. Gertrude smiled as though indulging him. Of course, though I hope Miss Selcombe is teaching her that disappointments should be borne gracefully. I am teaching her that grace and silence are not the same thing, Judith replied. Gertrude's gaze sharpened. A distinction that sounds cleverer than it is. Maurice set down his cup. It sounds exact. The support was quiet, but it changed the balance of the room. Gertrude turned toward him. You have been remarkably attentive to schoolroom philosophy of late. I have been remarkably inattentive to my daughter. The correction is overdue. For one moment, resentment passed nakedly across Gertrude's face. Then it vanished beneath social composure. I only hope such corrections do not encourage emotional dependence. Mabel must learn that a duke's duties cannot always yield to nursery wishes. Mabel looked at the candle again. Maurice answered without looking away from his daughter. Then I shall promise less and keep more. Gertrude left soon afterward, carrying the faint scent of violets and displeasure with her. Maurice remained through the end of tea. He did not ask Mabel to forgive him. He asked about her lessons, listened to an account of the Roman roads, and left only after telling her exactly when he would return the next day. When the door closed, Mabel touched the candle with one fingertip. Papa didn't say he would always come. No, Judith said. He promised tomorrow. That's smaller. Smaller promises are often easier to trust. The child considered this and nodded. The following morning, a disturbance below stairs interrupted geography. A young under-footman had been found weeping beside the service passage after receiving notice that he might be dismissed. Mrs. Trench brought him to Judith because the matter concerned the schoolroom schedule, though the boy was nearly too frightened to speak. He stood just inside the door with his cap crushed between both hands. Mabel had been taken to the day nursery for penmanship with the nursery maid, leaving Judith and Mrs. Trench to hear him privately. "Tell Miss Selcombe what you told me," the housekeeper said. The under-footman swallowed. Mr. Peveril said, "I disobeyed him, ma'am," he said. "I made him look foolish before his grace." "What did he ask you to do?" Judith said. "To hold messages for the schoolroom until after 4, he said. His grace didn't want interruptions while the county ladies were expected." "I thought he had authority." "On the birthday?" The boy nodded. "And before, once for the music lesson, he told me the hour had changed and that I wasn't to trouble anyone with the old time." Mrs. Trench's face hardened. "Why did you not speak when his grace questioned the household?" Mr. Peveril said a servant who contradicted a gentleman wouldn't keep his place. "My mother depends on my wages." Judith looked at his white knuckles around the cap. Here was the true force behind Cuthbert's confidence. He did not need legal power. He needed only servants who believed his displeasure could ruin them. "You obeyed an instruction given as though it came from the Duke," she said. "That does not make you dishonest. It makes me stupid." "No, it makes the chain of authority unclear, which is why his grace changed it." The boy's eyes lifted. "Will he dismiss me? You will tell him the truth. I will be present, and so will Mrs. Trench. Mr. Peveril will say I'm lying. Then he will say it before witnesses." Maurice received them in the study before luncheon. The stopped clock stood on its cloth near the window. Mrs. Trench had brought the sealed ivory packet from the locked drawer, but it remained unopened in her hand. The under-footman repeated his account in a trembling voice. Cuthbert, summoned from the breakfast room, listened with increasing contempt. "This is absurd," he said. "The boy misunderstood a simple instruction and now invents threats to protect himself." "I didn't invent them, sir. You forget your place." The boy flinched. Judith stepped forward before fear silenced him. "His place is not beneath the truth." Cuthbert turned on her. "And yours is not beside the Duke." The insult struck with deliberate precision. Judith kept her chin level. "At present, my place is where his grace asked me to stand." Maurice's expression became still. "And the boy's place remains in my service." Cuthbert stared at him. "You cannot reward disobedience." "He obeyed because you spoke as though you carried my authority. That authority is now withdrawn from assumption." Maurice addressed the under-footman. "You will not lose your position for giving an honest account. If anyone threatens your wages or your family's security, you will report it to Mrs. Trench." Relief moved through the young man so suddenly that he had to look down. "Thank you, Your Grace." Do not thank me for correcting what should never have been uncertain. After the servants withdrew, Cuthbert remained. You are allowing Miss Selcombe to turn your household against your family. Maurice looked toward Judith, then back to him. No, I am discovering which members of my family relied upon my household being afraid. Cuthbert left with his face set in cold offense. Judith waited near the desk. Maurice rested one hand on the back of the chair. You defended the boy before you knew whether I would. He needed the truth said before fear changed it. And if I had chosen to dismiss him, then I would have known more about you. His gaze held hers. You speak to me as though rank were irrelevant. It is not irrelevant. It is precisely why your choices matter more. The words settled between them with a weight. Neither tried to soften. Maurice looked toward the schoolroom clock. Gertrude says Mabel has become dependent upon you. Mabel trusts me. Is there a difference? Dependence asks me to replace everyone else. Trust allows me to help her believe others may become reliable. He absorbed that in silence. At 4 that afternoon, he arrived before the hour again. Mabel looked up from her copybook and smiled before she could stop herself. Gertrude, passing the open schoolroom door, saw it. She also saw Maurice take the chair beside his daughter, and Judith step away rather than claim the moment. Her expression did not change. Only her hand tightened around the cream silk wrapped over the broken corner of her ivory card case. By evening, she had informed the housekeeper that the county children's luncheon would include a recitation by Lady Mabel on filial gratitude. She gave the order as though the child's feelings had already been arranged. Lady Gertrude began the rehearsal without Judith's knowledge. It happened on the 12th morning after Mabel's birthday, during the half-hour when Judith was downstairs consulting Mrs. Trench about the luncheon seating. When she returned, she found the schoolroom door partly closed, and Gertrude standing beside the writing desk with a sheet of cream paper in one hand. Mabel stood near the empty mantel, reciting in a voice so careful that every word sounded borrowed. A grateful daughter does not measure a father's love by the hours he can spare. She smiles when he comes and smiles when he cannot, for duty is the highest proof of affection. Gertrude tapped the page again, and this time, do not look as though someone has asked you to confess a crime. Mabel straightened. A grateful daughter does not measure. Judith entered fully. Lady Mabel's history lesson was to begin at 10. Gertrude turned without surprise. History may wait. This is preparation for Saturday. Preparation for what? A recitation at the autumn luncheon. Several children will perform. Mabel must not appear less accomplished than the daughters of lesser houses. Mabel's eyes remained fixed on the paper. Judith crossed the room and held out her hand. May I see it? Gertrude gave her the sheet with visible reluctance. The verses praised obedience, silence, and smiling endurance. They mentioned a father's burdens 4 times and a child's feelings not at all. Lady Mabel did not choose this, Judith said. Children rarely choose what improves them. Does His Grace know she is to perform it? Maurice knows there will be a luncheon. That was not my question. The Gertrude's expression cooled. You are very protective of questions for a woman whose duty is to provide answers. My duty is to educate Lady Mabel, not to teach her that gratitude requires dishonesty. Mabel's head lifted. Gertrude noticed. There, that is precisely the influence I mean. She looks to you before deciding what she feels. Judith folded the paper once and placed it on the desk. She looked because adults were discussing her as though she were not present. A child of her station must learn composure. Composure is not the same as surrender. Gertrude stepped closer. The cream silk still covered one broken corner of her ivory card case, which lay beside Mabel's slate. Take care, Miss Selcombe. You are employed to form a young lady, not to encourage rebellion in a ducal household. I am employed to teach her truth. Your interpretation of it? No, her right to recognize it. The silence sharpened. Mabel looked from one woman to the other, then down at the unlit candle in its china saucer. Gertrude followed her gaze, and that should have been removed days ago. She reached toward it. Mabel moved first, covering the candle with both hands. The gesture was small, but fear flashed across her face. Judith placed herself between the table and Gertrude without touching either of them. Lady Mabel has been told she may keep it. By Maurice, no doubt. By her father. The distinction landed. Gertrude withdrew her hand. Then her father should also decide whether she will recite. Yes, Judith said, he should. Gertrude left the room with the recital page and her card case. She did not slam the door. Women like Gertrude rarely wasted anger on noise when a whisper could travel farther. Mabel remained standing beside the candle. Judith waited until the child's breathing eased. Did she tell you that you must perform? She said everyone would think I was spoiled if I refused. That is not the same as being required. Will Papa be ashamed if I don't? Judith sat beside her. You must ask him. Mabel traced a line in the saucer. Do I have to smile to prove I'm good? The question struck more deeply than tears would have done. Judith answered slowly. You must be courteous. You must not be cruel merely because you are hurt, but you don't have to pretend pain is happiness. Lady Gertrude says a lady never lets people see disappointment. A lady may choose privacy. That is different from being ordered to deny what happened. Mabel looked toward the empty place where the clock had stood. If I say I was hurt, Papa might think I don't love him. Love that cannot survive. Truth is not love. It is fear wearing good manners. A movement sounded in the corridor. Judith turned. Gertrude stood beyond the partly open door. Her face revealed nothing, but she had heard enough. Not the question, not the distinction, only the sentence that could be repeated badly. By luncheon, Cuthbert had begun doing exactly that. Judith learned of it from Mrs. Trench, who heard two county ladies remark that the governess believed filial obedience was merely fear in finer clothing. By afternoon, the story had sharpened further. Miss Selcombe was teaching Lady Mabel to challenge her father. Miss Selcombe encouraged displays of wounded feeling. Miss Selcombe considered aristocratic restraint a form of falsehood. Maurice summoned Judith to the library before 4. The stopped schoolroom clock remained in his study, and the sealed ivory packet had not moved from Mrs. Trench's custody, but the mystery surrounding them had been pushed aside by something less tangible and more socially dangerous. Maurice stood near the library fire, with Gertrude and Cuthbert facing him. Did you tell Mabel that obedience is fear? He asked. No. Gertrude lifted her brows. I heard the conversation. You heard the end of it. Judith kept her voice level. Lady Mabel asked whether she must smile to prove she was good. I told her she must remain courteous, but she need not pretend pain is happiness. Cuthbert gave a low laugh, a fine distinction for an 8-year-old. Children understand hypocrisy earlier than adults prefer. There, he said to Maurice. You hear the tone? Maurice did. Judith saw it in the tension across his shoulders. He trusted her more than he had 12 days earlier. He also knew that a duke's household could be judged by people who had never entered its schoolroom. What is this recitation? He asked Gertrude. A harmless verse on filial gratitude. every child will perform something. Mabel was not asked. She is 8. Must every lesson be negotiated? Judith answered before Maurice could. No, but an emotional confession written by an adult is not a lesson. Gertrude's smile thinned. You dramatize everything. You have arranged a county audience to hear a child praise the father whose absence you helped misrepresent. The room went still. Maurice looked at Judith sharply. Gertrude's face lost color, then recovered. That is an accusation. It is a warning. The luncheon is turning Lady Mabel into a performance. Cuthbert stepped forward, and you would prefer her hidden upstairs with only your version of events. I would prefer her not used by either of us. Maurice turned away, one hand resting on the mantel. For several moments, no one spoke. When he faced them again, his decision was measured. The luncheon will proceed. Judith's disappointment came quietly. He saw it. The invitations have been accepted, he continued. Cancelling now would confirm every rumor Cuthbert has encouraged. Then remove the recitation, Judith said. Gertrude answered first. That would humiliate Mabel before the other children. No, Judith said. It would disappoint you. Maurice's jaw tightened. Mabel may decide tomorrow whether she wishes to recite. A child cannot make such decisions under pressure, Judith said. Then I will speak to her privately. Privately, but not persuasively. His gaze met hers. Do you believe I would force her? I believe you are still learning how much she fears disappointing you. That truth cost her. Maurice did not rebuke her, but the room grew colder around his silence. He dismissed Gertrude and Cuthbert, then asked Judith to remain. You think I should cancel the luncheon? I think you should stop allowing other people to define recovery for your daughter. If I cancel it, Gertrude will claim you have isolated Mabel from society. And if you proceed, she will claim any discomfort proves my influence. Maurice looked toward the dark windows. There is no choice that avoids scandal. Then choose the one that harms Mabel least. He turned back. I will remain beside her throughout the luncheon. No one will question or correct her privately. If she does not wish to recite, she will not. Tell her that before the guests arrive. I will. At 4, Maurice kept his schoolroom appointment. Mabel sat beside the unlit candle, the recital page folded on her lap. He took the chair opposite her. Judith remained near the window, present but silent. Lady Gertrude says you are to recite tomorrow, he said. Mabel nodded. Do you want to? I don't want you to think I'm ungrateful. That is not what I asked. She looked at him carefully. I don't know. Maurice leaned forward. You may begin and stop. You may refuse before you rise. You may change your mind while everyone is watching. I won't punish you. Will you be ashamed? The question nearly undid him. No. Mabel studied his face for a long moment. Will you stay in the room? I will. The next afternoon, the long drawing, room filled with county families, polished shoes, silk skirts, and children trained to display accomplishment without appearing proud. Mabel waited near the pianoforte with the folded recitation in both hands. Maurice stood where she could see him. Judith remained several paces behind, close enough to reassure and too far to direct. Gertrude announced Lady Mabel's name. The room quieted. Mabel walked to the center, looked at her father, and unfolded the page. Her lips moved over the first line without sound. Then she lowered the paper, placed it carefully on the table beside her, and did not begin. For one suspended moment, no one in the drawing room seemed to understand what Lady Mabel had done. The county children stood in a neat half-circle near the pianoforte, their polished shoes aligned beneath hems chosen by attentive mothers. The adults watched from chairs arranged beneath the tall windows. Mabel remained alone at the center of the carpet, the recitation page resting on the table beside her, her hands empty. Lady Gertrude smiled first. It was not kindness. It was the expression of a woman who believed an interruption could still be shaped into obedience. "You have forgotten the opening line," she said. "Begin again." Mabel looked toward Maurice. He stood near the fireplace, exactly where he had promised to remain. Judith was several paces behind the child, close enough to be seen and too far away to guide her. Maurice gave his daughter a small nod. "You may stop if you wish." A murmur moved through the room. Gertrude turned to him. "Maurice, she cannot simply refuse after every guest has been assembled. She can." Mabel drew a breath. "I don't want to read it." The words were quiet, but the silence around them made them carry. One of the younger children shifted. A mother pressed 2 fingers lightly to her daughter's shoulder. Gertrude approached Mabel without touching her. "Why not?" "Because it says I should smile when Papa doesn't come. It says a daughter should understand duty. I do understand." Mabel looked at Maurice again. "I only don't want to say I was happy." Gertrude's gaze moved at once to Judith. "Who taught you that answer?" Mabel's face tightened. "No one." "Lady Mabel," Gertrude said with grave patience, "truth matters." Judith saw the trap before the child did. If Mabel named her, Gertrude would call it influence. If she denied it, Gertrude would call it deceit. Maurice saw only his daughter surrounded by witnesses, and the strain in his expression deepened. "Gertrude," he said, "that is enough, is it? The child has rejected a harmless verse before half the county. Someone has encouraged this defiance." Mabel's cheeks flushed. "Miss Selcombe said I need not smile when I am hurt." The room changed, not loudly. A few eyes turned toward Judith, then all of them did. Gertrude allowed the words to settle before speaking. "There it is." Judith stepped forward only 1 pace. "That is not the whole conversation." "It is the part," Lady Mabel remembered. "She asked whether she must smile to prove she was good. I told her she must remain courteous, but she need not pretend pain was happiness. You taught an 8-year-old to judge her father's conduct." "No, I taught her to recognize her own feelings without using them cruelly." Cuthbert Peveril emerged from beside a cluster of gentlemen near the door. He had remained silent until the room was ready to receive his conclusion. "This is precisely what I warned you of, Maurice. The schoolroom has become a court in which a child is invited to weigh her father's worth." Judith turned to him. "Lady Mabel has not been invited to judge anyone. She refused a public expression of gratitude because you told her injury excuses disobedience. I told her pain does not become gratitude because an adult writes it on cream paper." A faint intake of breath came from somewhere near the windows. Gertrude's voice softened, which made it more dangerous. "You speak of adults arranging a child's emotions. Yet it was you who allowed her birthday disappointment to continue beside an untouched cake, with the clock stopped and the room preserved like a scene prepared for discovery." Maurice's head turned sharply. Judith felt the accusation strike through the room. "I did not stop the clock," she said. "Nor did I know why it had stopped. But you kept the cake untouched. Lady Mabel had not permitted it to be cut." Cuthbert lifted one brow. A governess, unable to persuade an 8-year-old to eat, yet perfectly able to teach her resistance before society. The cake was cut that evening after His Grace arrived. After the emotional effect had been achieved, Gertrude said. Mabel's face had gone pale. "It wasn't Miss Selcombe's fault." Gertrude turned toward her. "Then whose fault was it?" Judith moved at once. Do not question her before this room. Why? Cuthbert asked. Because her answer may not suit you. Because she is a child, not evidence for adults to seize when convenient. Gertrude looked at Maurice. You hear how she speaks. She decides when your daughter may answer. She defines what your child should feel. She has placed herself between father and daughter so completely that Mabel cannot distinguish her own thoughts from Miss Selcombe's instruction. That is untrue, Judith said. Is it? Gertrude gestured toward Mabel. The child looks to you before she speaks. Mabel did look at Judith then, but not for an answer. She looked frightened that Judith might be taken from her. Maurice saw the glance. Judith saw him see it. In that instant, all the careful progress of the previous days collided with his oldest fear. He had failed his daughter by being absent. Now the room suggested that another adult had become indispensable in his place. Cuthbert spoke more quietly. A duke cannot permit a dependent woman to cultivate exclusive influence over his heir's household. Mabel is not my heir, Maurice said automatically. She is your child, Cuthbert replied, and society will judge whether you govern your own family. The words found their mark. Maurice's posture changed. He did not become cruel. That would have been easier to resist. He became formal. This gathering is over. Several guests began to rise. Gertrude remained still, watching him. Maurice looked toward Mabel. Mrs. Trench will take you upstairs. Papa, I didn't mean. You have done nothing wrong. His voice was gentle with her. Then he turned to Judith, and gentleness disappeared beneath authority. Miss Selcombe, you will withdraw from schoolroom duties until I have determined whether proper boundaries have been crossed. No one moved. The words were not dismissal, but in the silence of the drawing room, they sounded worse. A dismissal might have named a fault. This left suspicion to complete the sentence. Judith felt every gaze upon her. She did not look at Gertrude or Cuthbert. She looked only at Maurice. Before these witnesses, she asked. His face tightened. The concern was raised before them, and therefore you answer it by removing me before them, temporarily. Society is rarely precise with temporary disgrace. Mabel broke from Mrs. Trench's side and crossed the carpet. Papa, please. I said it wrong. Judith knelt before the child. No, her voice remained calm, though her hands had gone cold. You told the truth as you understood it. But they're angry. Adults have made a wrong decision. Your truth did not make it wrong. Mabel's eyes filled. Will you come upstairs? Judith glanced at Maurice. He had protected Mabel from questioning, but not from witnessing the consequence. Mrs. Trench will go with you. I want you. The plea tore through the room more effectively than any accusation. Judith did not gather the child into her arms. She would not give Gertrude the image she wanted. Instead, she held Mabel's hands. Listen to me. Loving me does not mean you have betrayed your father. Loving your father does not require you to pretend you were never hurt. Maurice flinched. Judith rose. Your Grace, I will obey the suspension until I have put my decision in writing. His eyes searched hers. What decision? Whether I remain in a house where private trust can be withdrawn before public witnesses. Gertrude stepped in. That sounds very like a threat. Judith turned to her at last. No, Lady Gertrude. A threat asks someone else to fear the consequence. A decision accepts it oneself. She inclined her head to the room with the composure expected of a woman who had just been stripped of standing before people powerful enough to repeat the story for years. Then she left the drawing room without haste. In the schoolroom above, the absence of the mantel clock made the wall look bare. The unlit 8th candle still rested in its china saucer beside the inkstand. Judith packed only what belonged to her. 2 plain gowns, her grandfather's small book on clock mechanisms, letters from the Selcombe rectory, the wages she had saved. She did not touch the candle, Mabel's books, or the schoolroom keys at her waist. Those would be surrendered properly. Mrs. Trench entered near dusk and closed the door behind her. His Grace has ordered a guest room prepared for you until this matter is settled. Judith folded a shawl into her trunk. Please arrange a carriage to Selcombe Rectory for tomorrow morning. Miss Selcombe. I will not teach Lady Mabel self-respect by accepting public suspicion and private shelter as though they were the same as justice. Mrs. Trench's eyes shone, but she nodded. Outside, the last county carriage rolled away from Rookhaven, carrying the story Gertrude had wanted. Inside, Judith finished packing before Maurice could decide whether his temporary judgment had already cost him something permanent. Maurice came to the schoolroom before breakfast. While Judith's trunk stood closed beside the wall and the grey light of morning pressed against the windows. He had not slept. That much was visible in the severity of his face and the loosened precision of his cravat. Yet he entered with the composure of a man who had spent the night arranging words into defences. Judith remained beside the writing desk. The schoolroom keys still hung at her waist. The unlit 8th candle rested in its china saucer near Mabel's slate. Mrs. Trench tells me you intend to leave this morning, he said. Yes, Your Grace. I have not dismissed you. No, then you need not go. Judith looked at him steadily. That is not the same as saying I should stay. His jaw tightened. The guest room has been prepared. Your salary will continue while I examine what occurred yesterday. You offer privacy after, giving suspicion an audience. I am trying to protect you from further gossip. The gossip began when you removed me before the people invited into your house. Maurice took 1 step closer, then stopped as though he had remembered that authority could become pressure merely by crossing a room. I did not accuse you of harming Mabel. You told the county you were uncertain whether I had crossed a professional boundary. Because the accusation was made publicly, and you answered it publicly by separating me from the child. He opened his mouth, but she continued. Private kindness cannot repair a public implication, Your Grace. A warm room and continued wages do not change what those people believed when they left Rookhaven. I can correct that when I had proof. You had enough knowledge to know I would not use Mabel against you. His expression changed. Pain reached him before anger could. I believed that. Not enough to say it. Silence settled between them. From somewhere below came the muffled opening of shutters and the measured steps of servants beginning the day. Judith had always thought great houses woke invisibly, as though order appeared by instinct. Now she understood how much fear and obedience could hide beneath smooth routine. Maurice glanced toward her trunk. If you leave now, Gertrude will claim it proves guilt. If I remain because Gertrude may speak, then she governs my life more completely than she governs your household. You would abandon Mabel to make a point? The words came too quickly. He regretted them at once. Judith's face did not alter, which made the mistake sharper. No, she said. I am leaving because I will not teach Mabel self-respect while surrendering my own. Maurice looked away. That was unjust. Yes, I am sorry. So am I. The simplicity of it left him nowhere to hide. He rested one hand on the back of a chair. What do you intend? I shall return to Selcombe Rectory. My aunt has kept a room for me since my father died. 8 miles from here. Yes, the roads are damp. A closed carriage will manage them. You have already considered everything. A woman in service learns to consider departure. Before a household remembers she may need one. His gaze returned to hers. You were not merely in service here. That is precisely the confusion Lady Gertrude has used. I was close enough to be blamed like family, and low enough to be removed like a servant. Before he could answer, the inner door opened. Mabel stood there in her morning dress, with Mrs. Trench behind her. The child looked from Maurice to the trunk. "You're going?" Judith crossed to her. "Yes." Mabel's face went white. "Because I said it wrong?" "No. Lady Gertrude asked me, and I answered badly." "You answered simply. Adults chose to use it badly." "Then I'll tell everyone again. You will not be put before another room." Mabel came farther in. "I can tell Papa now." Maurice lowered himself beside her. "You do not have to prove anything to keep Miss Selcombe." "But I want her." The plea struck all 3 adults. Judith knelt and took Mabel's cold hands. "Wanting me does not mean you must leave your father." "I could come with you." "No." The child recoiled as if the refusal were a rejection. Judith tightened her hold gently. "Listen to me. I love you too much to make you choose. But you're choosing to go. I am choosing not to stay where my honor has been made uncertain. That is different." Mabel's eyes filled. "Who will explain me to Papa?" Judith looked at Maurice. He did not look away. "Your father must learn to understand you without using me as an interpreter." Maurice absorbed the judgment in silence. Judith turned back to Mabel. "And you must learn to speak to him even when your voice shakes." "What if he doesn't understand? Then he must ask again." Maurice said quietly, "I will." Mabel studied him, searching for the limit of the promise. Then she released Judith's hands and crossed to the writing desk. She lifted the unlit 8th candle from its saucer with both palms and wrapped it in a square of plain paper that had been used for copy exercises. Her movements were solemn. When she returned, she held it out. "Take this." Judith did not reach for it immediately. "It belongs to you. I want you to keep it safe." "Until when?" Mabel's mouth trembled. "Until I know what after feels like." Judith accepted the small parcel. "Then I will keep it." Mrs. Trench turned away to hide tears. Maurice watched the transfer as though it carried more weight than any formal document. Judith rose and removed the schoolroom keys from her waist. She placed them in Mrs. Trench's hand. "These are all accounted for. The cabinet key is marked with blue thread. The lesson cupboard key is the smaller brass one." Mrs. Trench closed her fingers around them. "I will keep them." "Thank you." The gesture completed what the night before had only begun. Judith was no longer Mabel's governess. Maurice straightened. "Your final quarter's wages will be paid in full with an additional month. The wages owed, yes. No additional payment. You are entitled to compensation. I am entitled to what I earned. I will not take money that can later be described as silence." His eyes hardened, not at her, but at the possibility that she could reasonably fear such a thing. "No one in this house will say that. No one in this house will need to. The county will invent better wording." He gave a single, reluctant nod. "The carriage will be ready at 10. Mrs. Trench has asked her widowed sister to accompany you to the rectory." Judith glanced at the housekeeper. "That is very kind." "It is proper," Maurice said, "and necessary." "Yes." He hesitated. "I could forbid you to leave until the roads improve." "You could." "I will not." Their eyes met. In that restraint lay the first honorable thing he had offered her since the drawing room. He was letting her go, even though every instinct in him wanted to repair the damage before distance made it permanent. At 10, The closed carriage waited beneath the east portico. Judith's trunk had been secured behind it. Mrs. Trench's widowed sister, Mrs. Alder, sat inside with a travelling rug over her knees. Several servants stood at a respectful distance. None had been ordered to gather, yet they had come. Judith descended the steps with the candle parcel in her reticule and her dignity intact. Mabel held Maurice's hand at the top of the portico. The child did not run after her. Judith loved her more for the effort it cost. She paused before entering the carriage. "Goodbye, Lady Mabel. Not forever." "No, not forever." Mabel looked at the reticule. "You won't light it, not without you." Maurice came down one step. "Miss Selcombe." Judith waited. For a moment, he seemed close to asking her to remain for him rather than for the household. The words did not come. He understood, perhaps, that affection offered at the moment of injury could become another form of pressure. "The driver has orders to take the lower road," he said. "It is less rutted after rain." "Thank you, Your Grace. I will not send for you unless I have something more honest than regret." Her breath caught, though her face remained composed. "Then do not send too soon." He inclined his head. Judith entered the carriage. As it moved away from Rookhaven, she did not look back until the gates narrowed behind them. Mabel remained beside her father. Maurice had one hand on the child's shoulder, not restraining her, simply staying. Judith held the wrapped candle in her lap throughout the 8-mile journey. At Selcombe Rectory, after her aunt had welcomed her without questions, Judith placed the parcel beside her grandfather's old book on clock mechanisms. Then she drew a sheet of paper toward her and wrote 3 times across the top. 3:40, 4:7, 4:28. Cuthbert's false message had begun the deception before Gertrude ever entered the schoolroom. For the first time, Judith saw the birthday not as a collection of injuries, but as 35 missing minutes that could be reconstructed. Judith spent the first morning at Selcombe Rectory, turning memory into order. She placed her grandfather's book on clock mechanisms beside the wrapped candle, drew a line down the center of a sheet, and wrote every time she could prove. At 3:40, according to the kitchen maid who had carried fresh water upstairs, Cuthbert Peverell had crossed the West Passage after asking whether the Duke had already gone toward the North Gate. At 4:06, Judith had stepped into the day nursery. At 4:07, the schoolroom clock had stopped. At 4:28, Maurice had arrived. The missing minutes between those facts were not empty. They had been arranged. By 10 o'clock, Judith had asked her aunt for the rectory carriage and was on the lower road toward the tenant cottages near Rookhaven's north boundary. The rain had passed, leaving the hedges dark and the ruts shining. Mrs. Weller, the tenant spokesman's wife, received Judith in a small parlor warmed by a coal grate and crowded with mended chairs. Her husband came in from the yard with earth on his boots and surprise on his face. "Miss Selcombe," he said, removing his cap, "we heard you'd left the court." "I resigned." Judith did not offer the county's version. "I need to ask about the deputation on Lady Mabel's birthday." Weller looked toward his wife. "We were told 5 o'clock. By whom?" "Mr. Peverell. He came through the North Farms 2 days before. Said His Grace would see us at 5 and not a minute earlier because there was family business before then." Judith kept her pencil steady. "Did anyone later change the hour?" "No, miss. We reached the gate 10 minutes before 5. Mr. Peverell met us there and said His Grace had been called away." "Did he explain that the Duke had gone to the gate before 4 because he believed you were waiting?" Weller stared at her. "For 4? We were still at home then. His wife's mouth tightened. Mr. Peverell knew that. He spoke to us himself. Judith wrote the statement exactly and asked whether they would repeat it before witnesses. Weller hesitated only when he considered his tenancy. I don't want trouble with the estate. The Duke has already ordered that no tenant or servant is to suffer for telling the truth. Did he send you? No. Judith folded her notes. I came because the truth should not depend upon whether I am still employed. Weller looked at his wife again. She nodded. Then I'll say what happened, he said. From the cottages, Judith drove to the village clockmaker. Mr. Bell's shop stood behind a narrow window, crowded with watch faces, brass keys, and clocks that disagreed with one another by several minutes. He listened while Judith described the interval in which the schoolroom clock had stopped. Could that piece of ivory have fallen into place by accident? She asked. No. Could ordinary vibration have shifted it behind the pendulum? Not into the angle I found. He set a small practice mechanism on the counter. The sliver was pushed through the rear opening and pressed here. It arrested the movement cleanly. A person might do it without understanding the clock, but not without intending the result. Could you demonstrate that before witnesses? Mr. Bell removed his spectacles. I could, though I'd rather not stand against a lady. You would stand beside your own work. Judith met his eyes. Lady Gertrude's rank does not alter the mechanism. The old man gave a reluctant breath. No clocks are democratic in that respect. Then will you come if His Grace asks? If His Grace protects my business from retaliation, I will ask him to make that protection explicit. Back at the rectory, Judith wrote a concise chronology. She did not accuse Gertrude or Cuthbert beyond what the witnesses could establish. She named the Wellers Mr. Bell, the under-footman, and the nursery maid. She explained that the false Northgate message began before the clock was stopped, which meant the two acts had served one design. At the bottom, she added one request. No servant or tenant should be questioned until protection had been guaranteed. She sealed the letter and sent it by the rectory groom. At Rookhaven, Maurice received it shortly after noon. He read the chronology twice, then placed it beside the unopened household memorandum book. The schoolroom clock remained stopped on the cloth near the window. The ivory sliver remained sealed in its initialed packet inside the locked drawer, with Mrs. Trench holding the only key. Maurice had already learned that Cuthbert controlled the false appointment. Judith's letter gave the deception a shape. It also made plain that she had continued seeking truth after he had stripped her of position. He rang for the under-footman. The young man entered with Mrs. Trench, his face pale but his posture straighter than before. Maurice did not begin with accusation. You told Miss Selcombe that Mr. Peverell ordered schoolroom messages held. Yes, Your Grace, all messages. Anything after 3:30 that day. He said the county ladies were expected and that the schoolroom was not to be disturbed. Did he say the order came from me? He said, His Grace wants no interruption. I believed him. Did any message arrive? A maid came from the lower hall to say Your Grace had been sent to the north gate. Mr. Peverell told me not to carry it upstairs because Lady Mabel would be brought down soon enough. Maurice's expression hardened. Did Lady Gertrude know? The boy swallowed. She was in the west passage when he said it. Did she hear? I believe so. Belief is not knowledge. Maurice's voice remained controlled. Tell me only what you saw. Relief flickered across the servant's face. I saw her stop beside us. Mr. Peverell said the clock would do the rest. Lady Gertrude told him to lower his voice. Mrs. Trench went still. Maurice did not. He wrote the words down. You will not lose your position for this testimony, nor will your mother lose support from your wages. That is my order. The underfootman bowed, close to tears. Thank you, Your Grace. You should never have needed courage to report what was done in my name. After he left, Maurice asked for the nursery maid. She entered with red hands clasped at her apron and fear held rigidly in her shoulders. You were near the schoolroom at 4:06, he said. Yes, Your Grace. Who entered while Miss Selcombe was in the day nursery? The maid stared at the carpet. Lady Gertrude. How do you know the time? The corridor clock had just passed 4:05. I was carrying linen toward the nursery cupboard. What did she do? I saw her go into the schoolroom. The inner door was open, but Miss Selcombe was turned away inside the day nursery. Lady Gertrude stood near the mantel. Then she came out. The maid's voice dropped. The ticking had stopped. Why did you remain silent? Lady Gertrude said. His Grace wished no gossip. She said a maid who made accusations against family would not stay at Rookhaven. Maurice set down his pen. Did she mention Miss Selcombe? She said the governess would soon learn that feeling important was not the same as belonging. The words entered the room with quiet brutality. Maurice looked toward the stopped clock. For 16 days, it had shown the minute at which his daughter's hope had been turned into a scene. For 1 day less, Judith had carried suspicion he had publicly helped create. You will repeat this only before protected witnesses, he said. Until then, no one is to know you spoke. Yes, Your Grace. When the maid had gone, Mrs. Trench remained. Lady Gertrude has ordered her trunks prepared, she said. Mr. Peverell has asked for horses at dawn. Maurice rose. They will not leave before I have spoken with them. Will you confront them now? Not until every person they threatened knows I stand between them and consequence. At 4, he went upstairs alone. Mabel sat beside the tea table, the china saucer empty where the candle had once rested. She looked past him, perhaps expecting Judith despite herself. Maurice took the chair across from her. Miss Selcombe is not coming today, he said. I know, but I am. Mabel studied him. Because she told you to? The question deserved honesty. No, because she told me I must learn to understand you without her. Do you? Not yet. He folded his hands. But I am here to ask again. She looked toward the bare mantel. Will you stay until 5? Yes, even if someone says you're needed. They will have to wait. For the first time since Judith's departure, Mabel began to speak of her lesson rather than her loss. Maurice listened until the hour passed, proving change where Judith could not see it. At Selcombe Rectory, the groom returned with a formal card from Rookhaven. The Duke of Haverstock requested permission to make a morning call upon Miss Selcombe. It was not an order to return. Judith read it once, then placed it beside the wrapped candle and her completed chronology. Maurice arrived at Selcombe Rectory during the proper morning calling hour, not a minute before and not a minute after. The precision would once have seemed insignificant. Judith noticed it now. Her aunt received him in the small front parlour, where faded chintz covered the chairs and rain-bright light fell across a tray prepared for tea. She remained for the first exchange of courtesies, then took her embroidery to the adjoining room and left the connecting door open. Maurice had come with no secretary, no estate papers, and no message from Mabel. His restraint made the absence of those things deliberate. Judith sat opposite him, with the wrapped 8th candle hidden inside the drawer of a nearby escritoire. Her chronology remained on the table beside her grandfather's clock book. Maurice did not glance at either. "Thank you for receiving me," he said. "You asked properly. I should have done many things properly sooner." Judith waited. He seemed to understand that she would not ease him into the apology he had come to make. "I have spoken to the tenant spokesman, the north gatekeeper, the under footman, and the nursery maid," he continued. "Their accounts agree with yours. Cuthbert gave me a false hour. He ordered messages withheld. Gertrude entered the schoolroom at 4:06. The ticking stopped before she came out. Judith's fingers remained still in her lap. "Then you know I did not arrange the birthday scene. I know more than that." His voice lowered. "I know I had enough reason to trust your character before the witnesses in my drawing room. And I chose not to do it." The honesty of the sentence changed the air between them. Maurice did not soften it with grief or confusion. "I publicly implied that you might be unfit to remain with my daughter," he said. "I placed you under suspicion because I feared appearing weak before people who had already used my absence against Mabel. I told myself I was protecting the child and preserving order. In truth, I protected my authority." Judith looked at him steadily. "And afterward, you offered me a private room. Yes, and wages. Yes, as though safety behind a closed door could answer. Disgrace carried into the county. It could not." He leaned forward, but kept his hands clasped between his knees. "I expected private protection to compensate for public harm. That was cowardice dressed as prudence." Judith had imagined this conversation on the road from Rookhaven. In some versions, Maurice defended himself. In others, he spoke of Anne, duty, or scandal until his guilt appeared inevitable rather than chosen. She had not imagined him naming the offense so exactly. "Why did you come today?" she asked. "Not to ask you back as governess." "Good." Pain crossed his face, though he accepted the word. "Not to ask you to forgive me before I have corrected what I did, and not to use Mabel's distress as a summons." Judith's gaze sharpened. "How is she? She misses you. She also took tea with me at 4 yesterday and spoke for nearly an hour." Something in Judith's chest loosened despite herself. "You stayed until 5, as I promised. Would you have stayed if I had not known?" "Yes." His answer came without hesitation. "That is the only reason I have any right to tell you." She looked toward the rain, sliding down the window. Maurice had begun to understand that change performed before an audience was merely another form of display. "What do you intend to do with what you have learned?" she asked. "Gertrude and Cuthbert believe I will settle the matter privately. They have begun preparing to leave Rookhaven. I have stopped their departure until the evidence can be presented before the people who heard the accusation against you. Presented by whom? By the witnesses, and interpreted by you, if necessary." Judith shook her head. "That is not enough." He did not bristle. "Tell me what is." She turned back to him. "The same county guests who heard your suspension must hear its correction, not a smaller group. Not a letter written afterward. Agreed. Mabel must not be required to testify. She will not. Not even if Gertrude denies entering the schoolroom. Not even then. The servants and tenants must know before they speak that their places, wages, and homes are secure. I have already given that protection to those I questioned. I will repeat it before all witnesses." Judith studied him. "You must speak first." His brows drew together slightly. "Before the clockmaker? Before anyone. You must admit your own wrong choice before you name theirs." Maurice absorbed the condition in silence. She continued before affection could make either of them retreat from clarity. "If you begin by exposing Gertrude and Cuthbert, the room will conclude that your error was merely believing convincing lies. It was more than that. You knew me. You knew Mabel. You still chose rank, control, and appearance over trust. His face went still. You are right. Say it before them. I will. Judith's pulse shifted, but she did not look away. There is one further condition. Name it. No offer of employment may be attached to my exoneration. It will not be. No proposal of marriage either. That struck him, not because he had intended to make one today, but because the possibility existed between them now, unspoken and dangerous. Maurice lowered his gaze for the first time. You believe I might try to bind justice to affection. I believe gratitude, guilt, and love become difficult to distinguish when a powerful man offers all three at once. And if I told you I know the difference, then prove it by waiting. He looked at her again. The restraint in his expression no longer resembled coldness. It looked like a man holding something precious without claiming it. I will attach nothing to the correction, he said. Not employment, not courtship, not forgiveness. Judith breathed slowly. Then trust may begin again. The words seemed to affect him more than absolution would have done. Begin, he repeated, not return to where it was. No, because where it was broken cannot be restored. It can be remembered, Judith said. That is not the same as living there. Maurice sat back. From the adjoining room came the faint pull of thread through fabric as Judith's aunt continued sewing, present enough to satisfy propriety and distant enough not to intrude. May I ask something that has nothing to do with evidence? He said. You may ask. When you told me fear was not sufficient reason to fail Mabel, were you speaking only of her? Judith could have protected herself with formality. She chose truth instead. No. His breath changed. That was all. No declaration followed. He had agreed not to use emotion as payment, and he kept the agreement immediately. Then I have failed you twice, he said. First, by doubting you. Then, by nearly asking you to remain for reasons I had not earned the right to speak. You stopped yourself. Too late to prevent the harm. Not too late to prevent another. Their eyes held. The distance between their chairs seemed smaller than before, though neither had moved. Maurice's voice softened. May I call you Judith? The question carried more intimacy than a touch would have done. She considered him carefully. Not because you are a duke asking permission. Because I am a man who has accepted your conditions, then yes. He spoke her name once, Judith. She did not answer with his, not yet. Outside, carriage wheels sounded on the wet lane, then passed toward the village. Maurice rose. The annual harvest supper is 6 days from now. The great hall will hold the same families who attended the luncheon. I will invite the clockmaker, the north gatekeeper, the tenant spokesman, the under footman, and the nursery maid. You will attend as my guest if you choose, not as Mabel's governess. Never again, unless you yourself demanded it. I will not. Then, as Miss Selcombe. He hesitated near the door. There is one uncertainty. The ivory sliver proves deliberate interference, but not possession. Gertrude may claim her card case was damaged long before the birthday. She will. You sound certain, because she has already announced that defense. Maurice's gaze sharpened. How? County women speak quickly when they believe a governess has fallen. My aunt heard yesterday that Lady Gertrude intends to display the case and prove the missing corner is old. Then she will bring it herself. Yes. Judith looked toward her grandfather's book, and if the break is old, the exposed surface will show age. If it is fresh, the ivory within will be paler than the outer face. Will the clockmaker know the difference? He should. And if the sliver fits, then rank will have nothing to do with it. A faint, grim satisfaction passed over Maurice's face. For once, I shall be pleased to let the object speak. He bowed over her hand without touching it. Thank you for allowing me to come. Do not thank me yet. No. His eyes met hers. I will thank you after I have done what I should have done the first time. He left beneath the shelter of the rectory portico and entered his carriage for the 8-mile return to Rookhaven. Judith watched from the parlour window until the wheels disappeared beyond the hedgerow. Only then did she open the escritoire drawer and take out the wrapped candle. Trust had not been restored. It had been given a first honest hour. At Rookhaven that afternoon, Lady Gertrude informed Mrs. Trench that she would bring her ivory card case to the harvest supper and end the governess's accusations once and for all. Mrs. Trench conveyed the statement to Maurice. He listened without expression, then instructed her to invite Mr. Bell and ensure that the sealed packet remained locked until every witness stood in the great hall. Maurice told Mabel the truth 3 days before the harvest supper, in the schoolroom where the mantel still stood empty. The stopped clock remained in his study, its mechanism closed after Mr. Bell's examination. The ivory sliver remained sealed in its initialed paper packet beneath Mrs. Trench's custody. Nothing had been moved without record, yet the room itself felt changed. Judith's books were gone. Her keys no longer hung at her waist because she no longer stood there. The unlit 8th candle was gone as well, safe with her at Selcombe Rectory. Mabel sat at the writing desk with a copybook open and no words upon the page. Maurice took the chair opposite her. He had learned not to stand over difficult conversations merely because rank had taught others to endure it. I need to tell you why Miss Selcombe left, he said. Mabel's fingers tightened around the pencil. Lady Gertrude said she left because she knew she'd gone too far. Lady Gertrude was wrong. Mr. Peverell said you had to remove her because she made me disobedient. Maurice felt shame move through him with more force than anger. I removed her from the schoolroom because I was frightened. Mabel looked up. Of Miss Selcombe? No. Of what people would think. Of whether I had lost authority in my own house. Of whether I had allowed another person to become more important to you than I was. The child absorbed this slowly. She was more important when you weren't here. The words were not cruel. That made them harder to bear. Yes, Maurice said. She was. Were you angry with her for that? I was ashamed of myself, and I let that shame fall upon her. Mabel looked down again. You said she might have crossed a boundary. I did. Did she? No. The answer came without hesitation. She protected you. I punished her publicly for doing what I should have done. Mabel's lower lip trembled. Then tell her to come back. I cannot command her. You're a duke. That does not give me the right to command her forgiveness. Mabel studied him as though this was a new and difficult lesson in rank. Will she come to the supper? She has agreed to attend as my guest, not as my governess. No. The child's eyes filled, but she did not look away. Will they make me speak? No. Lady Gertrude will ask me questions. She will not. What if she says I'm the only one who saw her? Maurice leaned forward. You are not the evidence. You are my daughter. Mabel's breathing eased by a fraction. But I know she came into the schoolroom. You may tell me what you remember when you choose. You will not stand before the county and prove anything for adults. Even if it helps Miss Selcombe? Especially then. She thought about that. Will Miss Selcombe think I was afraid? She will know you were protected. That isn't the same. No. Maurice met her gaze. But children should not have to be brave so that adults may become honest. Mabel set down the pencil. Are you going to say you were wrong in front of everyone? Yes. Before you say Lady Gertrude was wrong? Yes. Will it be embarrassing? Very. For the first time, something almost like sympathy softened her expression. You could say it quickly. I deserve to say it clearly. Mabel nodded, then returned to the blank page. I don't forgive you yet. Maurice accepted the sentence without flinching. You do not have to. But you can come at 4. I will. He did. He came every afternoon before the hour, even while Rookhaven filled with preparations. The annual harvest supper had always been a display of order. This year, Maurice used that order for a different purpose. The families who had attended Gertrude's luncheon received formal invitations to the great hall. The wording referred only to the harvest gathering, but no one in the county believed the evening would be ordinary. Mr. Bell was asked to attend with his tools and the schoolroom clock. The north gatekeeper, the tenant spokesman, the underfootman, and the nursery maid were each told privately that their positions and tenancies would remain secure regardless of whom their testimony offended. Maurice repeated the assurance himself. He did not delegate courage after expecting it from others. Gertrude interpreted the preparations as a compromise. She told Mrs. Trench that Maurice would surely clear the matter quietly, preserve family dignity, and dismiss Judith's claims as excessive emotion. Cuthbert was less serene. He spoke of aristocratic solidarity, of the danger of elevating servants against gentlemen, and of the embarrassment that might follow if Maurice allowed a governess to dictate the terms of a family dispute. Maurice listened to neither argument. He gave them both permission to remain through the supper, because absence would allow them to pretend they had been condemned unheard. It was more fairness than either had offered Judith. On the afternoon of the gathering, Mrs. Trench carried the sealed ivory packet from the locked drawer in Maurice's study. She did not open it. She placed it inside a small dispatch case and retained the key. Mr. Bell supervised the movement of the stopped clock from the study. 2 footmen carried it carefully on a padded board toward the great hall. Its hands remained fixed at 4:07. Its rear case remained closed. The movement was observed by Maurice, Mrs. Trench, and the clockmaker, so no later accusation could be made about tampering. By dusk, carriages rolled beneath the porte-cochere. Candlelight brightened the great hall, where long tables had been laid with silver, autumn fruit, and greenery from the estate. The great hall clock above the carved screen kept steady time. Beneath it, one long table had been left bare. Judith arrived in a hired carriage with her married cousin Mrs. Fenwick, who lived 2 miles from Rookhaven and had agreed to offer her a room for the night. Judith entered not through the service passage, but through the principal doors as an invited guest. She wore a plain grey silk gown that made no attempt to compete with the jeweled women waiting inside. Her dignity required no ornament. Maurice met her at the foot of the stairs. He did not offer his hand until Mrs. Fenwick had joined them. Even then he only bowed. "Miss Selcombe, Your Grace." His gaze moved briefly to the small parcel she carried, plain paper folded carefully. He knew what it contained, the 8th candle. He did not mention it. "Mrs. Fenwick's room has been prepared in the east guest corridor," he said. "You will both remain under Mrs. Trench's formal hospitality." Judith inclined her head. "Thank you. You are seated among the county guests, not with the household staff." "No." His answer was immediate. "You are not in my employment. Something passed between them, not reconciliation. Recognition." He had remembered the boundary she required. Inside the great Hall conversation faltered as Judith entered. Some women looked away. Others watched openly. Gertrude stood near the hearth in dark crimson silk, her ivory visiting card case visible in one hand. The cream wrapping had been removed from the damaged corner. She wanted the break seen. Cuthbert waited beside her with the composure of a man relying on class to outweigh fact. Mabel stood with Mrs. Trench near the side door. When she saw Judith, her face changed with such naked relief that several guests noticed. Judith did not go to her at once. She looked first at Maurice. He gave the smallest nod. Only then did she cross the room. Mabel took one step forward, then stopped herself from running. "You came. I said I would." "Are you staying?" Judith answered carefully. "Tonight." Mabel glanced at the parcel. "You kept it safe." Yes, she did not hand it back. Not yet. Maurice watched them, then turned as Mr. Bell entered with the 2 footmen. Conversation died across the hall. Under the clockmaker's direction, the men carried the silent schoolroom clock to the long bare table and placed it directly beneath the great hall clock. Above them, the larger clock began to strike 7. Below, the smaller one remained frozen at 4:07. Maurice stepped into the space between the 2 measures of time. Every guest turned toward him. Gertrude lifted her chin, confident that family would still be protected before servants. Cuthbert folded his hands behind his back. Judith stood with the wrapped candle held against her palm. Maurice looked first at Mabel, then at Judith, and finally at the witnesses who had heard him fail. "Before any evidence is shown," he said, "there is something I must confess." "Before any evidence is shown," Maurice said, "there is something I must confess." The great hall held its breath. Above him, the larger clock completed its 7th stroke. Beneath it, the schoolroom clock remained fixed at 4:07, its silence more powerful than the sound that had just faded. Maurice stood without notes. Judith saw the effort it cost him not to hide behind rank, procedure, or the testimony waiting nearby. "I failed my daughter before anyone deceived me," he continued. "I mistook provision for presence. I believed that because Lady Mabel was housed, educated, and protected, she could not also feel abandoned." Mabel stood beside Mrs. Trench, very still. Maurice did not look away from her. "I also failed Miss Selcombe. I knew her character. I knew she had protected my daughter when I had not. Yet when her conduct was questioned before witnesses, I chose to protect my authority instead of her name. I suspended her publicly. That decision was unjust." A murmur moved through the gathered families. Gertrude's face hardened. Cuthbert looked toward the doors, but 2 senior footmen stood there under the butler's quiet direction. Maurice had not confined anyone. He had simply made departure impossible without notice. "Miss Selcombe did not manipulate my daughter," Maurice said. "She did not arrange the birthday scene. She did not teach Lady Mabel to despise me. She taught her that truth need not be cruel, and that love does not require pretending pain is happiness. I was too cowardly to say so when it mattered." Judith felt the words reach every person who had watched her leave the drawing room in disgrace. Maurice had fulfilled the first condition. He had not begun with Gertrude. He had begun with himself. Only then did he turn to Mr. Bell. "Show us what stopped the clock, Mrs." Trench unlocked the small dispatch case and withdrew the paper packet. The clockmaker examined the initials across the fold before breaking the seal. With brass tweezers, he lifted the ivory sliver and placed it upon a square of black velvet. "I found this behind the pendulum arm," he said. "It was pushed through the rear opening. It could not have fallen there." He opened the clock's rear case and demonstrated the narrow path. Placed at this angle, it stops the movement cleanly. Removed, the clock runs. Gertrude gave a low laugh. And you believe that proves anything beyond interference? Not by itself, Maurice said. He called the nursery maid forward. The young woman's hands trembled, but her voice did not. Maurice reminded the room that her position was secure. She then stated that at 4:06 she had seen Lady Gertrude enter the schoolroom while Judith stood in the adjoining day nursery. Gertrude had gone directly to the mantel. When she emerged, the ticking had stopped. You expect these people to accept the word of a maid over mine? Gertrude asked. Maurice answered, I expect them to consider whether independent facts agree. The under-footman came next. He repeated Cuthbert's order to hold all schoolroom messages and confirmed the words he had overheard in the West Passage. Mr. Peverell said the clock would do the rest. Lady Gertrude told him to lower his voice. Cuthbert stepped forward. A frightened boy may confuse any number of remarks. Then we shall continue, Maurice said. The North Gatekeeper confirmed that the tenant deputation had been appointed for 5. The tenant spokesman confirmed that Cuthbert himself had set that hour. Maurice then stated that Cuthbert had told him the men were waiting before 4 and had sent him across the estate. An innocent confusion, Cuthbert said. Followed by another, Maurice asked. A county lady who had attended the birthday tea was invited to speak, she admitted. Gertrude had asked several ladies to arrive at 4:30 and come upstairs to observe Mabel's condition before the cake was cut. Gertrude had said the child's distress would prove the household required a permanent female head. The pattern became visible without accusation. Maurice delayed. Messages withheld. Clock stopped. Guests prepared to witness a grieving child. Judith positioned as the cause. Gertrude positioned as the cure. I acted from concern, Gertrude said. Mabel needed stability. Judith spoke for the first time. Concern does not need an audience prepared in advance. Gertrude turned on her. You have always resented that blood gives me a place you could never possess. Judith remained calm. Then why did blood require a stopped clock, a servant's fear, and a child's humiliation to defend its place? Silence swept the hall. Gertrude's fingers tightened around the ivory card case she had brought to disprove suspicion. Maurice looked at it. You said the damage was old. It is. Then allow Mr. Bell to examine it. I will not surrender my property to a tradesman. You brought it as evidence. Every gaze in the room rested upon her. Refusal would speak too loudly. Gertrude crossed to the table and placed the case upon the velvet with a sharp movement. The cream silk had been removed. One corner was missing. Mr. Bell examined the exposed break, then lifted the sliver with his tweezers. The inner ivory is pale, he said. The break is recent. He turned the fragment carefully, the curved edge aligned with the missing corner. Not approximately, exactly. A tiny dark mark crossed from the case into the sliver, forming one continuous line. Gertrude's composure broke. That proves only that the fragment came from my case. It does not prove I placed it in the clock. The maid saw you enter, Maurice said. The clock stopped while you were there. Cuthbert arranged my absence. The messages were withheld. The guests were summoned in advance. Each fact supports the others. Cuthbert's voice rose. You would ruin your own family on servant testimony. You are not ruined by servants telling the truth. You are ruined by believing they were too powerless to be believed. Maurice turned so the entire hall could hear. Lady Gertrude Peverell and Mr. Cuthbert Peverell are no longer welcome at Rookhaven Court. All patronage from House Harcaster is withdrawn. The estate appointment discussed with Mr. Peverell is cancelled. A full written account will be sent tonight to the Earl who heads their family." Gertrude stared at him. "You would choose a governess over us?" "Miss Selcombe is no longer a governess in my employment. I choose truth over those who believed family connection excused cruelty." Cuthbert looked toward the county gentleman, seeking support. None stepped forward. The Duke had spoken after evidence, not instead of it. Maurice faced the servants and tenants. "No person who testified tonight will lose wages, place, tenancy, or favor for doing so. Any retaliation will be answered by me." Then he turned to Judith. "Miss Selcombe was never dismissed for misconduct. Her suspension was my error, and her resignation was an act of self-respect. Let no person in this county repeat otherwise without knowing he contradicts me." Judith felt the restoration settle not as rescue, but as rightful correction. Maurice did not approach her. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not turn justice into courtship. He had remembered every condition. Mr. Bell removed the ivory obstruction from the table and returned to the mechanism. With careful hands, he set the pendulum moving. The schoolroom clock began to tick. The sound crossed the great hall, small and steady. Judith opened the plain paper parcel she had carried from the rectory. The 8th candle lay inside, still unlit. She crossed to Mabel and placed it in the child's palms. Mabel looked up at her. "Should I light it now?" Judith glanced at Maurice. He stood where his daughter could see him, no papers in his hands, no door at his back. "When no one has to stop time for you again," Judith said. Mabel closed her fingers around the candle. The clock continued moving. Maurice did not propose. Judith did not promise to stay. When the supper ended, she left Rookhaven with Mrs. Fenwick, but before entering the carriage, she accepted Maurice's request for a formal call the following week. It was not forgiveness. It was not return. It was the first honest step into an hour neither of them intended to waste. 7 months later, on a clear morning in May, Maurice arrived at Selcombe Rectory, 12 minutes before the hour he had written in his final letter of courtship. Judith saw the carriage from the front parlor window and smiled before she could prevent it. During the months since the harvest supper, he had kept every appointment. He had come through winter rain, hard frost, and 1 week of flooded lanes. When estate business made a visit impossible, his message had arrived before expectation could become waiting. He never promised what he could not keep. He never used Mabel's longing to hurry Judith's forgiveness. Their courtship had unfolded through formal morning calls, letters written in careful honesty, and walks taken with Judith's aunt or Mrs. Fenwick near enough to satisfy propriety. Maurice had learned to speak of affection without turning it into a demand. Judith had learned that his restraint no longer concealed absence. It protected choice. On that May morning, however, Maurice did not enter the rectory to court her. He came to escort her to Rookhaven's private chapel, where she would become his wife. The marriage had been arranged under special license and kept deliberately small. There were no county spectators eager to compare triumph with scandal. Mrs. Trench attended. Judith's aunt and Mrs. Fenwick stood with her. Mabel waited inside the chapel in a pale blue dress, holding a small posy with such solemn concentration that Judith's throat tightened. The child was still 8. She had grown no taller by much, but she no longer watched every doorway as though affection might disappear through it. Maurice had been present for lessons, walks, music, and ordinary teas that offered no audience and earned no praise. He had learned that fatherhood was built most faithfully in moments too small for society to notice. Gertrude had not returned to Rookhaven. The Earl, who headed the Peverell family, had removed her from county society and placed her under the supervision of an elder relation. Cuthbert had lost the estate appointment he had expected, together with every advantage once attached to Haverstock patronage. He had not been imprisoned or theatrically ruined. His consequence was quieter and, to a man like him, more complete. Doors no longer opened merely because he spoke as though they should. The chapel bells did not ring for the county. Only the estate household heard them. Judith walked down the short aisle without a father to give her away, and Maurice did not reach for her until she chose to place her hand in his. He wore formal black, his expression controlled until their eyes met. Then the careful Duke vanished for one unguarded instant, leaving only the man who had once asked whether fear was sufficient reason to fail her. It had taken him 7 months to prove his answer. The clergyman spoke the familiar words. Maurice's vows did not promise to rescue her. He promised truth before comfort, partnership before pride, and no use of rank where trust should stand. Judith vowed to meet honesty with honesty, restraint with courage, and love without surrendering the self-respect that had first forced them apart. When the ring settled upon her hand, Mabel released a breath audible in the quiet chapel. Judith looked toward her. The portrait miniature of Anne had been placed discreetly near the family pew, not as a shadow over the marriage, but as acknowledgement that love did not require erasure. After the register was signed, Mabel approached Judith with unusual hesitation. "May I call you Mama?" she asked. Judith knelt, so their eyes were level. "You may call me whatever feels true to you." Mabel considered this with the seriousness she gave every promise. "Not yet." Then not yet. Relief softened the child's face. "I'd like to keep calling you Judith when we're alone." "I would like that too." Maurice stood beside them, and Judith saw gratitude in his expression because she had not asked Mabel to replace one mother with another. Anne remained part of the child's history. Judith would become part of her future by choice, not conquest. The wedding breakfast had been prepared in the small dining room, but before joining the others, Mabel asked for one private tea in the schoolroom. Maurice glanced at Judith. 4 o'clock, he asked. Mabel nodded. Exactly. The request might once have made him reach for his pocket watch. He did not. At 10 minutes before 4, the three of them entered the schoolroom together. The mantel clock had been returned after the clockmaker serviced it. Its case had been polished, but not altered. No attempt had been made to disguise what it had survived. The pendulum moved steadily behind the glass. On the tea table waited a fresh, small iced cake, made that morning and decorated with white sugar flowers. It was not the cake from Mabel's birthday. That first cake had been cut and eaten months before. This one belonged entirely to the present. 3 cups stood beside the pot. No chair was empty. Mabel carried a narrow parcel wrapped in the same plain paper. Judith had once taken to Selcombe Rectory. She had kept the 8th candle safe after Judith returned it in the great hall. Now she placed the parcel on the table and unfolded the paper carefully. The candle lay inside, still unlit, its beeswax slightly softened by months of handling, but otherwise intact. Maurice took his seat before the hour. Judith sat beside him, no longer positioned between father and daughter as interpreter, guardian, or necessary bridge. Mabel climbed into her chair and watched the moving clock. "It's 3:54, she said. "So it is," Maurice replied. "You're early. I had excellent instruction." Judith raised one brow, repeated instruction. The important sort generally is. Mabel smiled. The clock continued to tick. No one filled the remaining minutes with promises. Maurice poured tea. Judith cut the cake only after Mabel nodded permission. The knife entered the fresh icing, and 3 slices were placed upon plates before the hour arrived. At 1 minute to 4, Mabel set the candle into a small silver holder beside the cake. Her hand hesitated over the taper. Judith did not touch her. Maurice did not tell her it was time. The child watched the minute hand move. When the clock began to strike, the first clear note crossed the room. Maurice was already seated. Judith was already beside him. The cake had already been touched. On the 4th stroke, Mabel lit the candle. The flame trembled, then steadied. She looked at Judith. This is after. Judith's eyes filled, but her voice remained clear. Yes. Mabel turned to her father. You didn't check your watch. Maurice looked at the closed watch resting unseen in his waistcoat pocket. I didn't need to. Because you trusted the clock, he considered the question. Because I was where I had promised to be. Mabel leaned back, satisfied. For several moments, they listened to the mechanism carry time forward. Nothing had been erased. The stopped hour remained part of them. Judith's public humiliation, Maurice's failure, Mabel's fear, and the cruelty arranged around an untouched cake had not vanished because a wedding had occurred. They had been answered. Gertrude's exclusion remained. Cuthbert's influence remained withdrawn. The servants who had testified kept their positions. The tenants kept their homes. Mrs. Trench had established a permanent household rule that no guest could alter a child's schedule or issue commands in the Duke's name. Messages involving Mabel were repeated, confirmed, and written whenever possible. No child or servant at Rookhaven would again be punished for carrying unwelcome truth. Maurice lifted his teacup. To punctuality, he said. Mabel shook her head. That sounds dull. Judith smiled. To promises kept. Better, Mabel said. Maurice looked at his wife. Much better. They touched their cups together. The candle burned beside the fresh cake. The clock moved past 4 without fear. There was no audience, no applause, and no empty chair. Only a father who had learned to stay, a woman who had returned freely, and a child who no longer needed time to stop in order to believe she was loved.